I work on the Hudson River, and my job sort of marries my two passions together, which is education, teaching, and research. So I get to conduct research, and I get to teach people about it and talk to people, and it's great. And sort of how I marry those two things together is through community science outreach. So I was talking, if you were on a little bit earlier before the call started, right now my team is currently working on Day in the Life, which is a large community science outreach where we sample the Hudson River at usually 100 sites from New York City to Troy, and all of that data is collected by students. So that's a like 100% student-driven community science project. But my like true heart and soul is the American eel. That's my main study species, and that's what I'm gonna talk to you guys about today. And we have a community science, actually a couple community science projects that focus on the American eel and what we can do in the Hudson River to sort of keep track of their populations and conserve them and protect them. And so today in this program, I'm going to take you through the like amazing, magical, charismatic, mysterious life cycle of the American eel that I sort of touched on last month, but we're going to go in an even deeper dive into it this month. So we're going to talk about the American eel. I have some live specimens to show you. So we'll talk about them and how they live their life. And then I'm going to talk to you guys about our community science outreach effort that happens in the spring. And hopefully all of you will want to get involved and join us next spring once we start counting eels. So I'm going to share my screen because I do have some slides to show. All right. So I think probably the best option is if you click over on the side, or is it on the top? There's a way that you can see me speaking, like my box that I'm in, and my slides, where they're the same size. And if you can figure out how to do that, which if I figure out now, I will tell you.
I think it's in the upper right-hand corner. I have it already, so it's coming in as thumbnail video.
Yeah, I might not be able to do it if I'm the one sharing.
Is it not view options up at the top, or no?
Yeah, it's the view options, and then it's, you just want to click through them until you find the one where it's me, and then also the slides.
Side by side gives everybody's picture, not just you.
Okay.
Well, if you can only see me small, it's okay.
Okay.
That's fine. We'll work with it. I'll pull the slides off so that we can really see the eels when I get them up there. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the American eel, my like heart and soul animal that lives in the Hudson River. They're a really amazing species, and I feel very lucky that I get to study them, and I feel very lucky that I get to share my love with people like you all who are excited about the Hudson River and excited about what lives there, or at least, you know, somewhat interested because you showed up to this library program after work hours to learn about Hudson River fish. So before we get into the like biological significance of the eel, I think it's really important to take a step back and look at the cultural and historical significance that American eel has held here in the Hudson Valley and along the entire East Coast, because their range covers the whole East Coast of North America. So eel has been eaten in the United States, in other countries as well, but in the United States for thousands of years, including at the first Thanksgiving, if we want to call it that. There have been studies that have shown that if the white colonists, when they came to what would become the United States, if the indigenous people who were living here had not taught them to eat eel, that they probably would not have survived. And think about like how different our society would look today if that was the case that had happened. Because when the first white colonists came over, it was late fall, which there's not a lot really going on. When we think of the Thanksgiving story, we're like, oh yes, the cornucopia, the bounty, but they got here like late November or merging on December. Not really a lot going on. There's not a lot of stuff growing. it was not a great place for them to show up and not know what land they were dealing with, because they didn't know how to live here. They'd lived somewhere else. And so the indigenous people that lived here showed them that in the fall, that's when the adult eels are migrating out of the estuaries and into the ocean. And that's the ideal time to be catching really big female eels, like in this picture. Eel is a super fatty fish. And so there's speculation that if the indigenous people had not taught the white colonists to eat eel and get this like life-sustaining fatty fish food source, that they probably would not have survived their first winter. So with that in the back of our minds, as we're thinking about this, I want to take you all through the amazing migration story of the American eel, because they have a pretty crazy life. Every single eel starts its life actually not here in the Hudson River. It starts its life in the Sargasso Sea, which is in the Bermuda Triangle. And I do want to preface all these slides by saying, so at every age, eels look totally different. And because they look totally different, we call them different names. But every eel that I'm about to talk about is all the same species. We're talking about the American eel the whole time. But just based on how old they are, they're gonna look very different depending on their life stage. So their first life stage after they hatch out of their egg is the leptocephali. They're really tiny, like less than ½ an inch, super, super small. They're willow leaf shaped, totally clear, and they're basically a mouth attached to a spine. They don't really have fins at this time. They're sort of at the mercy of the ocean currents to drift them along. These guys end up hitching a ride on the Gulf Stream, which is like basically an underwater river that runs through the ocean along the whole East Coast. And the leptocephali, before they develop their fins, before they can really swim on their own, they hitch a ride on that, and it brings them up the whole East Coast. So somewhere off the continental shelf, they become glass eels. So they travel for almost a year as these tiny leptocephali. And then after about a year, they'll reach the Hudson River or other estuaries along the whole coast. They don't just come to the Hudson. But after about a year, they'll reach the Hudson, and right offshore, they will become glass eels, which is the next life stage. This is the stage that we sample in our community science project that I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. But these guys are really great to work with. They're also tiny, probably about 2 inches is like the max. Still totally clear. All you can see is their black poppy seed eyes, and you can see their hearts beating. If you like hold them in your hand and look really closely, you can see their hearts beating, which is really cool. And one of the first things to develop pigment is their spine. So in the very beginning, that's pretty much the only things that you can see. When they first come in, they're totally clear. And then as the season progresses a little bit, their spine will develop, and they'll have that nice long dark line along their whole body. So as they enter the estuary, they start eating things that are in the estuary and gaining pigment from that. So if you think about what the Hudson River looks like versus what the ocean looks like, it makes sense that they would want to be clear in the ocean, right? If you hold up a glass of ocean water, it looks pretty clear, even though it looks blue from far away. If you hold up a glass of it, it looks pretty clear. And so the eels just melt away into that to avoid predators. But then once they hit the Hudson River, the Hudson is pretty brown. Even if you hold up a glass of it, it still looks pretty brown. And that comes from turbidity. So that just means that there's a lot of things suspended and floating around, most of which is natural, is supposed to be there. The Hudson has a very soft bottom that has a lot of clay in it. Clay is the smallest particle size that you can have. And so when the tides mix that up 2 times a day, high tide, low tide, high tide, low tide, it churns up all those particles, and that's what makes the river brown or more turbid. So a lot of people think that the Hudson River is dirty, but it is just in the not in terms of pollution, but in terms of there is a lot of dirt that is in it that's being mixed up a lot all the time. And so the elvers, it's to their benefit to get darker in pigment to camouflage themselves. So glass eels want to be clear in the ocean so nobody eats them, and elvers want to be darker colored in the estuary so that nobody eats them. That being said, everything still eats them. Glass eels arrive to us in the very early spring, usually around the beginning to mid-February. So it's still really, really cold. Probably most of us wouldn't call that spring at that point, but that's when they first come to us. And if you think about what February is like, there's not a lot else biologically going on that's new to be eaten by things. There's no other baby fish that are hatching. There's no plants that are growing. Pretty much everything is still hunkered down, and all the energy that they had inside themselves, they're holding on to and waiting for spring. But when these glass eels come through, they're bringing a flood of ocean nutrients into the Hudson River ecosystem. So when they come in, everybody wants to eat them because they're a tasty sea snack that's full of all of these new nutrients that are being cycled through, and they sort of kickstart everyone's metabolism in the spring. Eels are super important because of this reason, because they fill in at many different trophic levels. So if you think of a food web, where your cow eats your grass and then we eat the cow, that's a short food web. But eels are part of a food web where when they're little, everybody eats them. But when they're bigger, they eat everybody else. So they're really important because they fill in at a lot of different levels, and that makes them really important to the ecosystems in which they live in. So they've made it. They've done their like 1,000-mile journey. They've made it here. They start to develop pigment, and then they're gonna stay here for a really long time. Research that we've done here and research that other scientists have done have shown that eels will stay put in the same like 100-foot reach of a tributary, which is a stream or a creek that runs into the river. They'll stay put in that 100-foot reach for almost the entire rest of their life. The females live for up to 30 years, and the males live for around 10 to 15. And the reason for that is because the males only need to get about this big. This is like the largest size that a male eel can get. Versus the females, which she doesn't even fit on my screen. She's so big. So females are the ones that need to lay the eggs. Obviously, they have to produce eggs, and that takes a lot of energy. And that's why she needs to be so much bigger. And I actually have a very special guest for you guys to introduce you to. Normally, we do not keep large eels in tanks. I'm gonna stop my share so that you all can see me and see what I'm about to show. Usually we do not keep large eels in tanks. Usually when we do our research, we collect them from the stream, we take our measurements, we let them go right where we caught them. Today, we have a very special case in that yesterday we were already planning to do a electrofishing survey, which is how we get the large adult eels. We were already planning an electrofishing survey, and we were contacted by a group of people from the Smithsonian who are making a documentary about eels, and they asked us if we could catch for them a couple big eels that they could film underwater for this documentary. So for you all, this is a very special treat. Literally no one ever gets to see this, but I have a really large female eel that I'm gonna show you all. And we'll take a minute to just like observe her and look at her, and it's gonna be great. So it'll take me a second to get set up, but here's my setup that she's gonna go in this tank. This eel you're about to see is gonna be a movie star. You saw her first, before anybody else. I have her in a bucket next to my table. And it might take me a second to catch her. Eels this size are pretty much all muscle, and they're one big slimy mussel. So here's our really large female eel. Again, we know that you guys see me if I come down here? Oh yeah, a little bit, right? So we know that this is a female eel because if an eel is over 45 centimeters, which this eel is, you can see how big she is like compared to my hand. If an eel is over 45 centimeters, that means that that eel is going to become a female. So technically all eels don't have a sex until they reach their final life stage, which we haven't talked about. This eel is still a yellow eel. But once they reach their final life stage, which is when they're sexually mature, that is when their gonads develop, and that's when they become male or female. So this eel technically right now doesn't have gonads, so she's not male or female. But because she's so big, we know that she will become a female eel. Do you guys have any, this is, I feel like a good point to pause if you guys have any questions while it's looking at her instead of looking at my face, and I can answer some questions if we have any.
Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask any questions you'd like.
It's okay if you don't have any too. I feel like I'm definitely throwing a lot of eel information at you. It's okay to feel a little overwhelmed. All right, cool. So the next life stage, that's our yellow eel. And again, this is a female because she's greater than 45 centimeters. And the males, again, will only get to be about this big. But if you catch an eel that's this size, you don't know if it's a young female who just hasn't grown big enough, or if this is a yellow eel, or if this is a male who's almost at the end of his life. There's no way to tell unless that eel is silver. So that's our next life stage. Let's see what happens when I go back in. Is it going to start me over? Great. So that's our next life stage is silver eel. So if you catch an eel that's this size and it's gone silver, you know that it's a male eel. And silver, again, is when an eel is sexually mature. And for males, that takes 10 to 15 years. For females, it takes up to 30. You can tell a silver eel because their backs get really, really dark up here, and their bellies get really, really light. That's a type of camouflage called counter shading. And if you think about some other ocean animals or other animals that like fly that are moving through the air column, so air column and the water column, that's a pretty typical camouflage. If you think about like red-tailed hawks, or think about penguins, or think about whales, things that are swimming or things that are flying. Because if you're a predator who's looking down at this eel, right, and I'm looking down at his dark back, and I'm in the ocean, I'm also looking down at the deep dark abyss of the ocean. And if I'm a predator who's looking up at this eel, and I'm looking at his light belly, I'm also looking up at the sun. And so that's a type of protective camouflage called counter shading. Because these silver eels, their job, once they sexually mature, is to make it back to the Sargasso Sea to spawn. Spawning is how fish reproduce. We hypothesize that eels are broadcast spawners, which is how many fish reproduce, which is where all of the eggs and all the sperm just get ejected out into the water and they sort of mix together and the eggs get fertilized. But I say we hypothesize because no one has ever seen eels spawning in the wild. So when I told you that all eels start their life in the Sargasso Sea, which is in the Bermuda Triangle, I should have said we think, because nobody really knows for sure where eels are spawning. There was this Dutch scientist who spent much of his life sailing around the Sargasso Sea, sampling for leptocephali, which are the tiny larval eels after they first hatch. Remember that first life stage? He spent a really good chunk of his life sailing around, sampling for them off the top of the water. And he made a map that we still use today, even though it was from so long ago, that we still use today, where he marked out areas with the different sizes of eels or leptocephali that he found. And based off that map, where he found the smallest leptocephali is where we think the spawning grounds are. So I just hit you guys with a lot of eel information. It's a lot all at once, a lot of different names. They look totally different. They don't even look like the same species, but I promise they're all the same species. I bet some of you are like, wait, can we go back to the we've never seen them spawning thing? Like, we need to go back to that. Okay, we can go back to that. And I bet you're also thinking, those people are thinking that. I bet you're also thinking, why don't you just put trackers on them so that you can see where they go, right? Is anybody thinking that? Usually there's at least one kid in the class who's like, why can't you just track them? The answer is, technology has not caught up with us yet. So the tags, a group of scientists tried to do this in 2015 and 2016, where they tagged 40 adult female silver eels. So the really big females. Females get up to 4 feet long. Really big female eels. And they put these tags on them that are pop-up satellite tags, similar to if you guys, if you track sharks or whales or anything like that, there's that app that you can use to look at where different sharks are. Those tags need to be exposed to air to beam data. And in the case of eels, eels don't need to come up to the surface. So if you tag a whale, that whale has to come up to breathe at some point. Eels, they don't need to. They just stay in the water and they stay deep. Eels are bottom feeders. They stay as deep as they can. So these eels that they sent out, they weren't coming up to the surface to beam their data. And we lost many of the tags. A lot of people, or a lot of the scientists that did this project, suspect that because the tags have air in them, so the tags separate after an amount of time, they separate from the animal and float to the surface to beam the data. The scientists speculate that because there was air in them, it slowed the eels down or just hindered their migration in some way. And it made them more susceptible to predators. So of that first round of 40, every single eel got eaten before they made it around the coast. So if you guys can see my mouse, so the eels were captured in Quebec, and all of the eels in the first trial got eaten before they made it around here. So when they did it again, the second time, they captured the eels, tagged them, and then brought them to where they all got eaten last time to sort of give them a leg up and release them. And of that 40, one eel made it to the edge of the Sargasso Sea. And it was huge news. We all got emails. It was a really big deal. And if you all have looked at scientific reports before or thought about science at all, you know that a sample size of 1 is usually not very exciting, right? Science is about replicating itself and being able to get the same result over and over. But we were really excited about this one eel because it is the only piece of information that we have about this return journey back to the Sargasso Sea. And we learned a lot from this one eel. So if you're looking at this graph, the eel was released off the coast of Nova Scotia. So that's where that purple triangle is. And then the purple path, the purple line is her path. So the different colors on the side is like the average placement of the different points. And then the purple line is the like median or the mean between them. So it's taking out the error of like the satellite not being completely correct, and this is following her path. So what do you think this says about her migration? She definitely doesn't go the fastest way, right? Probably the fastest way to get there is to just go diagonally from Nova Scotia down to the Sargasso Sea, she travels in almost completely straight lines. So we assume that eels, like birds, use the magnetic fields of the earth to help them migrate back to the ocean, to a place that they left when they were days old after being hatched. We think that they use the earth's magnetic field to navigate themselves, because look, she goes completely due east in a straight line, and then is like, oh, I went a little bit too far, comes and backtracks a little bit, and then goes straight down. So if you're looking over at the map on the side, you can see like Martha's Vineyard or Cape Cod is sticking out a little bit there, and you can see like Long Island sticking out. So that eel started heading straight from us past Bermuda. She swam in a straight line from us past Bermuda. That's insane. That's crazy. How did she do that? And it has to be the magnetic field. Not to mention, she crosses the Gulf Stream, which the Gulf Stream is, remember, an underwater river of water going the opposite direction of where she's trying to go. So she's getting there. And also, she's booking it to get there. It takes her 45 days compared to a year to make it to the Hudson. That's crazy. So I have not heard of this study being replicated yet, but I'm sure that it is in the process. We really just have to wait for technology to catch up, so that there are tags that are small enough that don't hinder an eel's migration. Because these tags are the same ones that we put on, like I said, sharks and whales and animals that are much bigger than an eel. So we really just have to wait for those tags to catch up. All right, does anybody have any questions on this kind of stuff? I know this is pretty dense, like scientific stuff, or did you think about any of your eel questions now that the like beautiful lady eel isn't in front of you anymore? No? It's okay, but feel free to also interrupt me, unmute yourself. This doesn't have to be a like totally just me lecturing at you. If you have any questions, feel free to either put them in the chat as I'm going, or just unmute yourself and you can ask your question. That's totally fine.
What do eels eat?
So it depends on how old they are, because like they look different in every life stage. They have a different food at every life stage. When they are the leptocephali, they're eating what's called marine snow in the ocean, which is basically like the dandruff of the ocean, like little flecks of things that are floating around from fish. And then when they come into the estuary as glass eels and elvers, they're eating small macroinvertebrates, which are like when you lift up a rock in a stream and there's a bunch of stuff moving around on the bottom, those are macroinvertebrates. So that's what they're eating. And then as they get bigger, they'll eat pretty much whatever they can fit in their mouth. They'll eat frogs and crayfish. Eels are also super cannibalistic. So if there's a lot of eels really living dense in an area, they will eat each other. So depending on how old they are, they eat totally different things. And like I said at the beginning, so when they first come in, everything is eating them. All the fish, all the birds, everybody's eating them. But then by the time they're the size of like this lady over here, she's the top predator in her stream and she's eating everybody else. So it's cool how that like level shifts throughout their lifetime. It's a good question.
So how long does it take how long does it take to get to Quebec, and how do they get there? You said I could see how they get to the Hudson River. Yeah,
so the same way. So the Gulf Stream runs like along the East Coast up to here. So they make it here and then they must swim the rest of the way. So I'm assuming that by the time they reach there, they become the glass eels as they're going up. And if you look at the European eel is another similar anguillid species. So American eel is Anguilla rostrata, and European eel is Anguilla anguilla. So they're very closely related. They spawn in the same gyre, like in the same area out in the Sargasso Sea. they can't breed together. They are separate populations. They have different genetics. They're not breeding together, but it's just in the same area. And the European eels have much further to travel, obviously, than the American eels. And so my colleagues have done glass eel work in Europe, like in Ireland, in Scotland, and their glass eels, when they catch them, are much bigger. So they look like our glass eels, which are about this big, but glass eels in Europe are like almost twice the size. They're the same size as our like mid-level elvers. But they're still, glass eels are still totally clear because they're spending more time in the ocean. So I would assume that eels that are making it, or the leptocephali glass eels that are making it up to Quebec, that they're doing the same thing, where they develop into glass eels somewhere off the continental shelf and then finish that journey all the way up, and they're much bigger when they enter the estuary.
Question. So when you're saying that, does that mean you think that they go all the way up to Nova Scotia first and then come down, or do you think some go directly to the southeastern coast?
So I was speaking about glass eels, which are the little babies that are first coming to us.
Right.
So that the glass eels will come and then they'll stay put for up to 30 years.
Right.
So the eels that are in the Hudson River, now we don't have data on this, but I would assume that they're not going up to Nova Scotia and down, which I think
Right.
is what your question was.
Yeah.
I'm sure that they're just meeting our eel somewhere along her path and then traveling down. But we don't have data on that. We really don't know. We need more eel scientists to be asking these questions and putting more data out there, doing more research.
How long do they stay like around Hudson in the Hudson River?
So the females will stay for up to 30 years and the males will stay for around 10 to 15 before they become silver and go back to the ocean to spawn once. And then I forgot to say that once they spawn, they die. So they only are spawning once in their entire life. That's also why the females need to get as big as they can to carry all of those eggs, because it's a one-shot deal. A female eel can hold up to 20 million eggs inside of her because she only gets to spawn once at the end of her life. And the reason that we know that they die is because they stop eating when they become silver, and they actually digest their own gut. So silver eels do not have an intestinal tract. They don't have a stomach. They absorb all of those organs to get that nutrients and get that energy for that journey, and to make space for their gonads within their body cavity. So it's pretty crazy. No one has ever seen like a field of dead eels out in the middle of the ocean, so we can say this is where the spawning grounds are. But we do know that they die because there's no way that they could survive after absorbing all of their organs, which is pretty crazy.
When you catch an eel and you release it, does it tend to stay in the same place the rest of its life, or does it move around?
Yes, definitely. While we're doing questions, I'm gonna stop share so I can see everybody too. So we do a study here at Norrie Point. So I forgot to say, I work at the Norrie Point Environmental Center, which is in Staatsburg, which is pretty close to Rhinebeck. That's where my office is. Hudson River is right here, right in front of me. We do a study here in the stream that is next to our office, which is called the Enderkill. And we have been sampling for yellow eels in that stream since 2013. When we get those eels, or we look at those eels the same way that we caught this big eel the other day. We go out with it's called a backpack electrofisher. And it's basically a car battery that you wear on your back, and then you can shock the water around you, and any eels that are there will get shocked for a fraction of a second. And you have two people on either side of you with nets that scoop them up real quick and put them in a bucket. By the time they're in the net, they're not shocked anymore. It's really a very quick shock. And so we put them in the bucket, and then we bring them on shore. We count them, we weigh them, we take length measurements, and any that are big enough, which is 25 centimeters. So this is about 25 centimeters, like where my hands are holding. Any eel that's this size, we put a pit tag in them. And so a pit tag is like a microchip for your cat or dog, size of like a grain of rice. And we insert it under their skin like a microchip. And that means, so that tag is not sending information. It's different from the satellite tags in that other study. Satellite tags are beaming information. These tags, you can only get the information off of them if you capture the animal again. So we've been tagging eels in the same 4 sections of this stream since 2013. And I would say 9.8 times out of 10, when we recapture an eel, which means we've caught it another year in the stream, 9.8 times out of 10, that eel is going to be in the exact same stretch of stream that we caught it in the first time, and the second time and the third time if we catch them over and over.
Right.
So they really seem to find a spot that they like, and then just stay put. If they find a spot with a lot of food, with a lot of protection, a lot of good habitat, a spot that probably won't dry up in the summertime in the stream, if the water level gets too low, they'll just stay put. That being said, you find big female eels like this one as you go further and further up in the tributaries. So eels are also spending their time moving up, and so you won't find big eels like this really close to the Hudson. Most of them are going to be much, much further up. That's a good question.
Can you find eels in the Rojan as it reaches the Hudson River?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Big time, right?
For
Yeah.
sure, for sure.
That's what I thought.
I've never electroshocked there, and we don't have a fyke net there, which is how we catch the eels, but they're definitely in the Rojan. Yeah. Pretty much any stream in the Hudson Valley,
very far
Romania.
away, very
I'm sorry, I
far
didn't hear that
away
question.
from the Hudson in the Rojan, like, I don't know, like near the Taconic or something. Will you still find eels there, or only near the Hudson?
You'd be surprised how far up you can find eels. They go really, really far. So that being said, dams and barriers are a big barrier, pun intended, big barrier to eels. And I'm speaking about human-made dams and human barriers, not like waterfalls. But yeah, so the more dams and barriers that are on a stream, the less eels you'll get as you move up further, but the bigger eels you'll find.
Right.
Are they being affected by pollution anywhere? Man-made?
Yeah, definitely. Yes, please. Thank you. Sorry, my coworker just came in. Yeah, so eels are a pretty generalist species, and we find them in pretty, thank you. Now I'm all washed out, gotta adjust a little bit. We find them in streams that are polluted. They're definitely not a fish that we use as like an indicator to tell us when streams are polluted, because they can handle, compared to other fish, they can handle higher levels of contaminants and things like that. They're good in low oxygen streams. So they're definitely not, sometimes people will say that eels are an indicator species, and that's not true. They are very important. They're very important to the ecosystem, but they're not an indicator of like a good quality stream. But that being said, human impacts are having a really rough go at eels, thinking about dams and barriers, thinking about pollution, thinking about overfishing, thinking about habitat loss, you know, that whole checklist of things that negatively affect many species, if not all species on Earth, because of humans' impact on the environment. They affect eels a lot. And they affect eels, I think, even on a more compound level, because they use so many different habitats. So eels are using the ocean, right, when they first hatch, and they're using it to spawn. So they use the ocean. They're using that whole trajectory, still the ocean, but they're using that whole trajectory up to the East Coast, and they're using estuary habitats. So if something happens out in the ocean, it messes up the new eels that are going to be hatching and migrating up for the next year. And if something happens in the estuary and it messes up the eels who are going to be returning and going back to the ocean, you know, that really wreaks havoc on their whole life system. It's a good question too.
How old do you estimate eels? I mean, how many eons ago did eels start, let's say?
Oh, I don't know that answer for sure. I would definitely look that up, but they've been around for a long time. They don't have very many branches off of them. And that's typically how you like determine a species that's been around for a long time, is they've stayed pretty much evolutionarily the same for a really, really long time. Another fish that we have in the Hudson that I talked about last month that's similar to that is the Atlantic sturgeon, which are I don't have a picture or anything with me, but they're the fish that get up to 14 feet long that live in the Hudson, that are covered in like bony plates and look like dinosaurs. They literally are dinosaurs. They've been around since dinosaurs, and similar to eels where they've stayed pretty much evolutionarily the same. Can you guys see this eel like freaking out in the corner over here? But that's something that I would need to look up to give you an exact like year answer, because I don't know that for sure. You got anything else?
What kind of fish
Have all
eat
your eel
the
questions
eels?
now. I'm ready.
What fish eat the eels?
So when they're young, everybody eats them.
Yeah.
Like I said, when they first come in, all of
when
the
they're
adult
mature,
fish that are here. Sorry, go ahead.
When they're mature, what kind of fish eat them?
Yeah, so when they're mature, they're not going to be in the main stem river. They're going to be in creeks and streams in relatively low water. If I took any of you all out electroshocking, you would look at the streams that we go in and be like, there's no way that there's fish in here. There's no eels. There's no fish in here. This is ankle deep water. My eel's trying to escape.
They don't stay in there.
I got the brick on there. And that is where like we'll catch a bunch of eels. So they are the biggest thing in that system for sure. I would say eels are probably the biggest predator to eels, is that it's larger eels eating eels that are smaller than them.
Right.
Because there's nothing else that's bigger than them. If they're a large female like this, there's nothing else that's bigger than them in the habitat where they're living.
Right.
But I just thought of another one, is that eagles really like to eat eels. Everybody loves the bald eagles and seeing them in the winter time. They're one of the first, like you can still watch them in the winter and it's really exciting. Eagles really like to eat American eel because they're a super fatty fish. So they'll catch them and bring them back to their nestlings because they're really like nutritionally dense and really like full of calories for their nestlings.
When you consider our location geographically, how popular a food is it for humans?
Geographically in like the Hudson Claverack area, or
Yeah,
geographically
exactly.
in
Yes.
the US?
No, in the Hudson, in our area.
In our area. So you can't eat eel out of the Hudson River. I mean, you technically can, but it is not recommended by the CDC. Eels are bottom feeders. So an eel that and they're living most of their life in the Hudson. So if you think about, you can eat striped bass out of the Hudson, right? But striped bass have the opposite life story of American eels, where they're just coming into the estuary to spawn and then they leave. They're spending most of their life out in the ocean. And striped bass have the sweet life cycle of being able to do that multiple times in their life.
Right.
They'll only spawn once. So you should not eat eels out of the Hudson because they've spent too long in the like mucky bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking about like the United States as a whole, eel is not as popular as it is in like Asian countries or European countries. But in many Asian countries, they eat Japanese eel, which is a relative of the American eel. And they eat in Europe, the European eel, which again is a relative of the American eel. But what we've seen, an American eel in Europe and in Asia is less than. They'll always choose to eat European or Japanese over American eel. But what we've seen in the past 100 years is that because the level of people wanting to eat eel has raised slightly or stayed the same, the eel have gotten super overfished, the European and the Japanese eel, and their populations have plummeted. And so the global food stage is starting to rely on the American eel to support all of these people who still want to eat eel. And now their populations are going down as well. And that's why we run our citizen science project sampling for glass eels, which are the baby guys. We run that study to look at what the populations are doing in the Hudson River so that we can submit that data to the people who make, it's called a stock assessment, to the people who make the rules about how many eels can be fished commercially. Yeah, because we're really worried about losing them, and eels don't spawn in captivity. They will only spawn in the Sargasso Sea, somewhere in the Sargasso Sea that we don't know where. We can't get them to spawn in captivity, so that means that once they're gone, they're gone. Every eel that people eat, whether it's sushi from a Japanese restaurant or whether it's jellied eel that I don't think you can get anywhere in the US, but it's really popular in Europe for some reason. Any of those eels are wild caught eels. They are all from the wild. There's no farm raised eel. So
Good answers.
Well, what kind of bait do they like? I mean, if I was fishing in the Hudson and I wanted to catch an eel, what would I use?
if you were fishing with rod and reel, probably literally anything. I've seen people fish for them with cheese before. They'll go after that. But eels oftentimes, especially the big ones, they'll swallow the hook.
Oh,
And it's
God.
really hard to get it out
Yeah.
without hurting them. If you
Right.
want to see a big eel, here is my advice to you. Go to your local creek. I'm talking like little, where you look in there and you're like, there's nothing in there. In that creek, I want you to find the first or the second barrier. So a big dam or a waterfall, something like that, that's gonna make a big pool in the bottom. And you're gonna go there at night. And you're gonna go with like an industrial, I'm talking like auto mechanic shop floodlight.
Yeah.
And you go and you shine it on that like, it's called a scour pool. You shine it on that scour pool, there will be one large eel in there who will come up to the light and let you look at her.
That's interesting.
Sure.
Okay. Got it.
That's my advice. Instead of trying to fish for them, especially because it usually damages their insides and really hurts them.
Yeah.
If you just want to see one, that's my advice to you.
Right.
I'm from Wisconsin, and I'm a member of the Mohican Nation there. And so in readings and in stuff, it was one of our major food sources was the eel. And so on a trip to New Jersey, I happened to go to a supermarket and see a bunch of smoked eels hanging there. I was man enough to try one. So I was wondering, do you figure that those eels were not American eels?
Those eels probably were American eels. Where did you go to Mitsuwa in New Jersey? Is that the grocery store you went to? The, like, big
I don't remember. I was
store?
in Cherry Hills doing a job, you know. It was just an American supermarket with one of those delis in it, you know.
Gotcha.
But they had multiple smoked eels there, and I thought I should try one, but.
Was it good? Did you like it?
I didn't.
You didn't?
I didn't try it. I wasn't man enough.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, so pretty much any eel that is eaten in the US, unless it's like tinned in the UK and imported, pretty much any eel that's eaten in the US is an American eel because they're not choice in countries where eel is a higher priority to eat as a protein source. And if you've ever eaten unagi in a sushi restaurant, that is eel. And probably the life cycle of that eel that you ate in that Japanese restaurant is that That eel was caught as a glass eel off the coast of Maine. That's the only state that allows for commercial fishing of glass eels. So the little guys. This is the only state in the US that you're allowed to commercially fish. And they only give out like 10 permits a year because glass eels go for $2,600 a pound. And the reason for that is because the glass eels will get captured by the commercial fishermen. Then they get shipped to China to be grown to market size because there's currently no eel aquaculture in the US. Not that it's not legal, but it hasn't been done here because there's not as much of a market for it. So those eels would get shipped to China to be grown in aquaculture to market size, which is even smaller than this lady that I showed you here. Grown to market size, shipped to Japan to be processed because you can't eat raw eel. It has a neurotoxin in it, so it has to be smoked and processed. That's why you saw smoked eels in the supermarket. That's why eels that you eat on unagi as sushi are always smoked and in like that teriyaki sauce because they have to be cooked before you can eat them. So here's a chain. If you missed it, the chain is caught in Maine, sent to China, sent to Japan, sent back to that sushi restaurant in New York that you went to. Like, again, like 9.9 times out of 10, that is the story of the eel that you're eating in the US, which is pretty crazy. Pretty crazy.
I've eaten,
These were like 18 to 24 inches.
Oh, it was the whole eel. It wasn't even just fillets.
Yeah, they were hanging there smoked, yep, and for sale. And that's why I was wondering what you were talking here. Didn't sound like that's very common.
Very cool. Yeah, that is not very common at all. There's one person in New York, and his name is escaping me right now. I don't remember what it is, but he is one of the only people, if not the only person in New York that has a permit to fish for the adult eels. He has a weir, which is like an ancient way that people used to fish using the tide. So it's like a funnel made out of rocks, basically, that's in the middle of a stream. And when the tide comes in, it's covered up. But then when the tide goes out, all of the animals are trapped inside. And that's how people fish for eel. He works out of the Delaware River. So I take that back. My 9.9 times out of 10 is the glass eels who go through that, that long process. But there's also one guy that works on the Delaware River that could have been his like big adult eels that he catches. But that would be my 0.1 out of 10 for like likelihood.
I've eaten sauteed little tiny eels in Spain.
That's another really popular dish as tapas is. I don't remember what it's called, but they're like really spicy and you eat them on toast. You take the glass eels and you fry them and they're really little. They look like spaghetti.
They're really delicious, actually.
I believe it. Right. A lot of people like to eat eel. A lot of people really like to eat eel. It's a pretty like cross-cultural board. I would say in the United States, it's not as popular, but with indigenous tribes that live here, that still live here, it's still a very like respected animal and still a major part of their food source. And most tribes and indigenous people they have special regulations about how much they can fish. So it's separate from the like US government mandates on fishing.
During these pandemic days in the Rhinebeck area, what kinds of educational programs can you still run for elementary school kids?
I have been talking today. I talked from 7:30 a.m. until 2 p.m. to Wappingers Junior High School kids, so 7th graders, talked to them all day about day in the life, which was the project that I was talking about at the beginning, and the Hudson River. So we are still doing a bunch of virtual programming. So like I'm coming to you guys today, we're doing this pretty much all day zooming into teachers' classrooms. So we're still doing virtual, which is good. We'll show a lot of live animals. We have a bunch of different programs that we offer. I'm not the only educator that works here. We have 6 other people who are doing similar education virtual programs. So we're sad to not see students in the classroom. I really miss having students, but we're still getting down there, and we're still talking about the Hudson River with anyone who will listen to us.
So we're not a part of the public school system. How could we participate?
Do you go to Oakwood? What's the Rhinebeck school that you go to, or that your students are at?
No, we don't go to school.
Or home?
No,
Yeah.
well, we're grandparents, but we like to interest our grandchildren when they visit us. How do we do so?
So I would keep an eye on your local libraries for programs like this virtually. We are also really hoping that in the spring, I didn't really get to talk about the project because we had lots of good eel conversations, which is totally fine. But usually in the spring, we have 14 nets that we place out in the river from New York City to Troy. And if you live in Rhinebeck, the closest one to you is in the Enderkill in Statsburg, which is where I am right now, where I was talking about that yellow eel study and the eels moving. That's the closest to Rhinebeck. And that is usually, if it's not COVID times, 100% volunteer collected data. So it's another community science project. Those nets stay out for a whole season, so 6 to 8 weeks. They're rebarred, hammered into the stream, and they get checked every day by different volunteers. So I would say if you want to get involved with that project, that's an amazing thing to do with students or young people of any age. Starting, I would say the smallest wader size that they make is size 6. So if you have like really little kids, they would have to wear boots or stay on shore. But it's a really great project to get students involved in, because it's a really like I was talking about the electrofishing, you don't expect to see them, and then you open up this net. And I mean, I've been doing this for years. How I got this job is I started volunteering in high school with this project, and then did it in college, and then got this job after college. So I've been collecting eels since I was like 13. And I still get excited every single time I open up a net, because it's so magical. You don't expect them to be there. They're not something that you're thinking about all the time. And then you open up that net, and there are sometimes thousands of little tiny eels just all in there. And I don't know, it's magical. I think everybody should do it at least once in their life. And then after that one time, you'll get hooked and you'll want to do it all the time. But
We did something like that in Germantown last year.
in Germantown?
They had an area, I don't know who sponsored it, but they collected, our grandkids went in the water and collected all kinds of fish, including eels.
Was it in the Sawkill?
No, it was right in the Hudson, right in Germantown.
That could have been somebody. That could have been somebody probably with a seine net. So did you bring the net out into the water and drag it? Yeah.
And
so
then they
that's a
brought it
seine
in
net.
and they put it in jars and tried to figure out what the fish were, and it was terrific. It was a great program.
Honestly, that was probably us or Clearwater. We're the two organizations.
No, it probably was you. I think it was you.
Yeah. But so these nets, we don't put them out in the water every time we want to fish. They stay out all the time.
Wow.
I mean, for not the whole year, but they stay out for 8 weeks. They get hammered into the stream and put in place. So every day people go and open them and look for them.
Wow.
They're specially designed to only catch glass eels also.
Oh my God.
So you're not catching anything else in them besides the like really tiny eels. So when you open it up, it's just, it's all little eels.
That's great.
It's very exciting.
Okay.
So if you want to get involved, I'm going to put my email in the chat. And you can definitely drop me an email. We're really hoping that next year, it looks like I can't send it to everybody because I'm not the host. But if I send it to Brenda, I think she can put it in. it's not letting me like select everyone. I'm not sure why.
I was
That
going
could
to
be
say,
why you
also,
guys weren't asking questions in the chat.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I have it. And I have one question for you. I just saw from Adrian in the chat, and then I'll send everybody the email. And it goes back to spawning. Could they possibly be spawning in multiple locations, and that's why only one made it to the Sargasso Sea?
That's a really good question that I think we don't really know the answer to. So I don't want to automatically be like, no, that's definitely not happening, because we've been surprised by eels before. You know, a little bit over 50 years ago, people thought that eels spontaneously emerged from the mud. Sigmund Freud was really into eels and eel reproduction. You should look up like the work that he did on eels. That's how he got into like his like obsession with sex and things like that, is he was studying eels and he was obsessed with the quest for like how do eels reproduce. So we have a lot of really low hanging fruit for scientific questions to ask about eels. So I don't want to immediately say like, oh no, like they're definitely all together. But I will say that genetically, we know that it's called a panmictic species. So when you look at their genetics, we know that they are breeding within one population. There's not a lot of animals that do that. And so their genetics look really specific and really different. And again, that's called panmictic. So we know that they are all coming together and breeding together because of their genetics. But that being said, that's not the first time that scientists have been wrong. Scientists have been wrong so many times. Science is about the quest for knowledge and trying things over and over and looking at things. And I think one thing that like COVID-19 has taught us is not to just accept everything that is said to us, and really to like ask questions of ourselves and like research things and go into things and really like think about things, and to not take everything at face value. So I would say that like, yes, my scientific background with my degree and me studying eels says this, but that doesn't mean I'm right. We could come out in 10 years with something that totally turns all of genetics on its head. And I wouldn't be surprised at this point. Not much surprises me anymore, I feel like.
I just wanted to say that about the chat. If everybody before they leave can just put in the chat box how many people you have watching this, participating today, so it gives us a more accurate count of how many people have come to the program.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you, Toby.
We keep
And
track of
Adrian,
that too.
I can get you that information. I'll send you from last month also.
Great, thank you so much. Did I hear another question coming in?
Of course not.
I was wondering about the CDC said, is that like a mercury question? Or?
So I heard a little bit of that. I heard CDC and I heard mercury. So I'm assuming your question was about like fish consumption regulations. And again, I couldn't hear your whole question, but I would say I would look that up on the CDC website and see where those guidelines come from. So as the DEC, we enforce those regulations and we give the CDC information to set those regulations. So scientists that work for the DEC will be testing for mercury, testing for PCBs, testing for other contamination in the Hudson, in the fish that people fish to consume. But we turn that information all over to the CDC, and we don't set those regulations. Once they tell us what they are, we educate people on them, and we do give them information on how to set those regulations, or we give them the information that they use to set them, but we don't set them ourselves. So I would say your best bet for any questions about that would be to look at the CDC website and their like breakdown of guidelines. Hopefully that answered your question. I only heard CDC and mercury, and I used some context clues to put that together. So we're coming up on over 7. I talked to you guys for so long about eels. Thank you all so much for being here. If you have any other burning questions about eels, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you're like, oh my gosh, I need to ask this person about this. I'm just thinking about it all the time, which for some of you will happen. Once the door is open to eels, you can't be shut. You'll start thinking about them all the time. Please email me. I obviously love to talk about eels, and I would love to talk to you about eels if you have any questions. If you want further reading, or not reading, if you want further listening, because who has time to read right now? I say in a library program. But we have a podcast, Radio Lab made a podcast that me and some of my coworkers are featured on. I think it's from last year at this point. I think we filmed it around this time last year. But they came and interviewed us while we were electroshocking. It's called Silky Love. And it is all about the mystery of eel reproduction. And my coworker, who's an amazing storyteller, is the main person on that podcast. So if you wanna listen to that, it's a really great resource. I also totally take back my reading thing. I don't know what I was saying. Don't listen to me. I've been here since 6 a.m. this morning. Don't listen to what I'm saying. There are many popular eel books that are probably available at least through interlibrary loan at your library. One came out like last month that's really recent that I haven't had time to read yet, that is called, it might just be called Eel. It's the most recent book on eels. James Prosek also has a book on eels that is really popular. Richard Swide has a book called Think of an Eel that is really popular. So if you want to get more into the eel mythology, but also eel biology, and really dig deep into eels, I would recommend going to your local library, getting them through interlibrary loan, and reading those.
And Aiden, don't we remember, Toby, that Aiden did a wonderful story hour on a Friday morning and read 2 children's books on eels. And I know that they are in the library system. I think we had one at the Hudson Area Library, and we ordered the other one that you read. So they are available to the grandparents that we heard from and other people.
Yeah, there's some great eel children's books out there. And I think, didn't we record that as well? I don't know if that got put anywhere.
Oh, I don't think, I'll have to check it, and I should put that up. And if anyone wants to leave me their email, I'll get you all of these kind of links and things that Aiden's been mentioning, like the Virtual River Nori project someone put in the chat, and then the Silky Love podcast, which, how could you say no to that? So I think there's, and I'll reiterate with her email so that you can reach out to her directly. But this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Getting excited about eels.
Very much.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.